So let's formally start. Once we start record, Ibrahim is going to introduce the Henry George School and welcome everybody. Then I'm going to introduce from the bios, Michael and Pepe, and then Michael will start with rent and rent seeking. Others who have comments or questions, we'll put that in chat, and then we'll go to the chat at some point. Okay?
Yeah. So
all right, so Ibrahima.
Yes, good morning and welcome. My name is Ibrahima Drame and I'm the Director of Education at the Henry George School of Social Science. It's a great honor to have you with us today for this joint webinar co-organized with the International Union for Land Value Taxation, with two great thinkers, Professor Michael Hudson and Pepe Escobar, to discuss rent and rent seeking. I'd like to thank Michael and Pepe for kindly accepting to share their insights. And of course, our good friend, Alana Hartzog, co-founder of Earthright Institute. She will be moderating this session. So before I hand it over to Alana, I'd like to ask all attendees to keep their microphones muted until we open the Q&A session. In the meantime, you are free to use the chat and please do so responsibly. Alana, please go ahead and introduce our speakers.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much to Michael and Pepe for joining us and having this conversation. I know that you two have admired each other's work and writings for many, many years. So this is your first time to actually talk together. So I'm going to introduce you both from your bios. Michael Hudson is an American economist, professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a researcher at the Levi Economic Institute at Bard College. He's a former Wall Street analyst, political consultant, commentator, and journalist. He identifies himself as a classical economist. Michael is the author of J is for Junk Economics, Killing the Host, The Bubble and Beyond, Super Imperialism, subtitled The Economic Strategy of American Empire, Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, and The Myth of Aid, among others. His books have been published, translated into Japanese, Chinese, German, Spanish, and Russian. Pepe Escobar, born in Brazil, is a correspondent editor at large at Asia Times and columnist for Consortium News, Washington, D.C., and Strategic Culture, Moscow. Since the mid-1980s, he's lived and worked as a foreign correspondent in London, Paris, Milan, Los Angeles, Singapore, Bangkok. He has extensively covered Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, China, Iran, Iraq, and the wider Middle East. Pepe is the author of Globalistan, How the Globalized World is Dissolving into Liquid War. Red Zone Blues, a snapshot of Baghdad during the surge. He was contributing editor to The Empire and The Crescent, and Tutto in Vendita in Italy, and his last two books are Empire of Chaos and 2030. Pepe is also associated with the Paris-based European Academy of Geopolitics. When not on the road, he lives between Sao Paulo, Paris, and Bangkok. So we'll have Michael begin now, and he's going to describe what the meaning is of rent and rent seeking, and we'll just take it from there. Please put comments and questions in chat. Thank you. Let's go.
Well, I'm honored to be here on the same show with Pepe and discuss our mutual concern. And I think you have to frame the whole issue. China is thriving, and the West has reached the end of the whole 75-year expansion it had since 1945. So there's an illusion that America is deindustrializing because of competition from China. And the reality is there's no way that America can reindustrialize and regain its export markets with the way that it's organized today, financialized and privatized. And if China didn't exist, you'd still have the Rust Belt rusting out. You'd still have American industry not being able to compete abroad simply because the cost structure is so high in the United States. The wealth is no longer made here by industrializing. It's made financially, mainly by making capital gains, rising prices for real estate or for stocks and for bonds. In the last 9 months since the coronavirus came here, the top 1% of the US economy grew by $1 trillion. It's been a windfall for the 1%. For the stock market is way up, the bond market is up, the real estate market is up, while the rest of the economy is going down. Despite the tariffs that Trump put on Chinese imports, trade with China is going up because we're just not producing materials. America doesn't make its own shoes. It doesn't make its own nuts and bolts or fasteners. It doesn't make industrial things anymore because if money is to be made off a industrial company, it's to buy and sell the company, not to make loans to increase the company's production. It's in New York City, where I live, it used to be an industrial city, and the industrial buildings, the mercantile buildings have all been gentrified into high-priced real estate. And the result is that Americans have to pay so much money on education, rent, medical care, that if they got all of their physical needs, their food, their clothing, all the goods and services for nothing, they still couldn't compete with foreign labor because of all of the costs that they have to pay that are essentially called rent seeking. The housing in the United States now absorbs about 40% of the average worker's paycheck. There's a 15% taken off the top of paychecks for pensions, Social Security, and for medical care, Medicare. Further medical insurance adds more to the paycheck. Income taxes and sales taxes add about another 10%. Then you have student loans and bank debt. So basically, the American worker can only spend about one third of his or her income on buying the goods and services they produce. All the rest goes into the FIRE sector, the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, and other monopolies. And essentially, we've become what's called a rent-seeking economy, not a productive economy. So when people in Washington talk about American capitalism versus Chinese socialism, this is confusing the issue. What kind of capitalism are we talking about? America used to have industrial capitalism in the 19th century. That's how it got rich originally. But now it's moved away from industrial capitalism towards finance capitalism. And what that means is that essentially the mixed economy that made America rich, where the government would invest in education, in infrastructure, in transportation, and provide these at low costs so that the employers didn't have to pay labor to afford high costs. All of this has been transformed over the last 100 years. And we've moved away from the whole ethic of what was industrial capitalism before. The idea of capitalism in the 19th century, from Adam Smith to Ricardo to John Stuart Mill to Marx, was very clear. And Marx stated it quite clearly. Capitalism was revolutionary. It was to get rid of the landlord class. It was to get rid of the rentier class. It was to get rid of the banking class, essentially, and just pare all the costs that were unnecessary for production. Because how did England and America and Germany gain their markets? They gained their markets basically by the government picking up a lot of the costs of the economy. The governments would, in America, provided low-cost education, not student debt. They provided transportation at subsidized prices. They provided basic infrastructure at low costs. And so government infrastructure was considered to be a fourth factor of production. And if you read what the business schools in the late 19th century taught, like Simon Patton at the Wharton School, it's very much like socialism. In fact, it's very much like what China is doing. And in fact, China is following today by itself in the last 30 or 40 years, pretty much the same way of getting rich that America followed. It had its government fund basic infrastructure. It provides low-cost education. It invests in the high-speed railroads, in the airports, in the building up the cities. So the government bears most of the costs, and that means that employers don't have to pay workers enough to pay a student loan debt. They don't have to pay workers enough to pay enormous rents, such as you have in the United States. They don't have to pay workers to save for a pension fund to pay them pensions later on. And most of all, the Chinese economy doesn't really have to pay a banking class, because banking is the most important public utility of all. Banking is what China has kept in the hands of government, and Chinese banks don't lend for the same reasons that American banks lend. 80% of American bank loans are mortgage loans to real estate. And the effect of loosening loan standards and increasing the market for real estate is push up the cost of living, push up the cost of housing. So Americans have to pay more and more money for their housing. Either they're renters or they're buyers, in which case the rent is for paying mortgage interest. So all of this this cost structure has been built into the economy. China's been able pretty much to avoid all of this because its objective in banking is not to make a profit in interest, not to make capital gains and speculation. It creates money to fund actual means of production, to build factories, to build research and development, to build transportation facilities, to build infrastructure. Banks in America don't lend for that kind of thing. They only lend against collateral that's already in place because they won't make a loan if it's not backed by collateral. Well, China creates money through its public banks to create capital, to create means of production. So you have a diametric opposite philosophy of how to develop between the United States and China. The United States has decided not to gain wealth by actually investing in means of production and producing goods and services, but in financial ways. China is gaining wealth in the old-fashioned way, actually producing it. And whether you call this industrial capitalism or state capitalism or state socialism or Marxism, it basically follows the same logic of real economics, the real economy, not the financial overhead. So you have China operating as a real economy, increasing its production, becoming the workshop of the world, as England used to be called, and America trying to draw in foreign resources, live off foreign resources, live by trying to make money by investing in the Chinese stock market, or now moving investment banks into China and making loans to China, not by actual industrial capitalism ways. So you could say that America's gone beyond industrial capitalism, and they call it the post-industrial society, but you could call it the neo-feudal society. You could call it the neo-rentier society, or you could call it debt peonage, but it's not industrial capitalism. And in that sense, there's no rivalry between China and America. They're different systems going their own way. And I'd better let Pepe pick it up from there.
Thank you, Michael. This is brilliant, and you did it in less than 15 minutes. You told the whole story in 15 minutes, actually. Well, my journalistic instinct is immediately to start questions to Michael. So this is exactly what I'm going to do now. I think much better than basically illustrating some points of what Michael just said, comparing the American system, which is finance capitalism, essentially, with industrial capitalism that it's in effect in China. Let me try to start with a very concrete and straight to the point question, Michael. So, hello?
Yeah.
No, because there was a huge boom in the background. I saw. So okay, we are still on.
Yeah.
Not interfered by the NSA yet. Okay. let's say that more or less the Chinese way, if we want to put it, if we want to summarize it, basically they try to tax non-productive rentier class. Yeah. So so this would be the Chinese way to create wealth redistribution, right? There is a sifting through the Chinese economic literature. There is a very interesting concept, which is relatively new. Correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, in China, which they call stable investment. So stable investment, according to the Chinese, would be issuing special bonds as extra capital, in fact, to be invested in infrastructure building all across China, and they choose these projects in what they call weak areas and weak links. So probably in some of the inner provinces, or probably in some parts of Tibet and Xinjiang, for instance. So this is a way to invest in the real economy and in real government investment projects, right? So my question, in fact, is, does the system create local extra debt or extra local debt coming directly from this financing from Beijing? And is this a good recipe for sustainable development, the Chinese way, and a recipe that they could expand to other parts of the global south?
Well, this is a big problem that they're discussing right now. The localities, especially rural China, and China is still very largely rural. The localities only cover about half of their working budget from taxation. So they have a problem. How are they going to get the balance of the money? Well, there's no official revenue sharing between the federal government and its state banks and the localities. So the localities can't simply go to China and say, give us more money for the localities. The government has left the localities very independent of them, and it's sort of the let 100 flowers bloom, and so they've let each localities go the long way. But the localities have run a big deficit. What do? Well, in the United States, they would issue bonds on which New York is about to default. But in China, the easiest way for the localities to make money is, unfortunately, they will do something like Chicago did. They will sell their tax rights for the next 75 years for current money now. So a real estate developer will come in and say, well, look, we will give you the next 75 years of tax on this land because we want to build a project on this, a set of buildings. So what this means is that now the cities have given away their source of rent. Are we still on?
Apparently we're on. Yeah.
Let me show you. The problem is what Indiana and Chicago did. Chicago also was very much like China's countryside cities. It sold its parking meters and its sidewalks to a whole series of Wall Street investors, including the Abu Dhabi investment fund, for 75 years. And that meant that for 75 years, this the Wall Street consortium got to control the parking meters. So they put up the parking meters all over Chicago, raised the price of parking, raised the cost of driving to Chicago. If Chicago would have a parade and interrupt parking, then Chicago has to pay the Abu Dhabi and Wall Street company what it would have made anyway. And this became such an awful disaster that finally Wall Street had to reverse the deal and undo it because it was giving privatization a bad name here. The same thing happened in Indiana. Indiana was running a deficit, and it decided to sell its road to a Wall Street investment firm to make a toll road. The toll road on the Indiana Turnpike was so high that drivers began to take all of the side roads. that's the problem if you sell future tax revenues in advance. Now, what China and what the local localities there are discussing is, how do we, now that we've already given the real estate tax at very, very low estimates to the commercial developers, what do we do? Well, what I've advised them to do, Alana didn't say, but I'm a professor of economics at the Peking University School of Marxist Studies, and I've had discussions with the Central Committee, and I also have an official position in Wuhan at the universities there. We're discussing how China can put a added tax for all of the value of the land that's gone up. How can it begin to let the cities collect this tax? It's sort of like as if the our claim is that the cities, in selling these tax rights for 75 years, have sold what in Britain would be called ground rent, what's paid to the landed aristocracy. And over and above that, there's the market rent. So China should pass a market rent tax over and above the ground rent tax to reflect the current value. And they're thinking of, well, do we say that this is a capital gain in the land? Well, it's not really a capital gain until you sell the land, but it's a value, it's a valuation of the capital. And they're looking to do whether they should just say, this is the market rent tax over and above the flat tax that has been paid in advance, or it's a land tax on the capital gain for land. Now, all of this requires that there be a land map made of the whole country, and they are just beginning to create such a land map as a basis for how do you calculate how much the rent is. And there's really, what I found in China is something very strange. It's the first, a few years ago in Beijing, they had the first International Marxist Conference where I was the main speaker, and I was talking about Marx discussion. The main discussion of the history of rent theory is in Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Capital, where Marx discusses all of the classical economics that led up to his view. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, John Stuart Mill. And Marx's theories of surplus value is really the first history of economic thought that was written, although it wasn't published until after he died. Well, you could see that there was a little bit of discomfort in some of the Marxists at the conference. And so they invited, for the next time, my colleague, David Harvey, to come and talk about Marxism in the West. Well, David gave both the leading and the closing speech of the conference and said, you've got to go beyond Volume 1 of Capital. Volume 1 was what Marx wrote as his addition to classical economics, saying that there was exploitation in industrial employment of labor as well as rent seeking. And that then he said, now that I've done my introduction here, let me talk about how capitalism works in Volume 2 and 3. And Volume 2 and 3 are all about rent and finance. And David Harvey has published a whole book on Volume 3 of Capital, and his message to Peking University and the second Marxist conference was, you've got to read Volume 2 and 3. Well, you can see that there's a discussion now over what is Marxism. And my friend and colleague at PKU, Sasha Buzgalin, said, Marxism is a Chinese word. It's the Chinese word for politics. That made everything clear to me. Now I get it. So I'm working now with, I've been asked by the Academy of Social Science in China to create a syllabus of the history of rent theory and value theory. And essentially, in order to have an idea of how do you calculate rent, how do you make a national income analysis where you show rent, you have to have a theory of value and price. And rent is the excess of price over the actual cost value. Well, for that, you need a concept of cost of production, and that's what classical economics is all about. That's what, and post-classical economics denied all of this. The whole idea of classical economics is not all income is earned. Landlords don't earn their income for making rent in their sleep, as John Stuart Mill said. Banks don't earn their income by letting debts, just sitting there and letting debts accrue interest and compounding and doubling. So the classical economists separated actual unearned income from the production and consumption economy. Well, around the late 19th century, in America, you had economists fighting against not only Marx, but also even against Henry George, who at that time was urging land tax in New York. And so at Columbia University, John Bates Clark developed a whole theory that everybody earns whatever they can get. There's no such thing as unearned income, and that's become the basis for American national income statistics and thought ever since. So if you look at today's GDP, gross domestic product figures for the United States, they have a figure for 8% of the GDP is for the homeowner's rent, what homeowners would pay themselves if they had to rent the apartment to themselves. You have interest at about 12% of GDP, and I thought, well, how can interest be so steady? What happens to all of the late fees at 29% that credit card companies charge? And I called the national income people in Washington when I'm there, and they said, well, late fees and penalties are considered financial services. And so this is what you call a service economy. Well, there's no service in charging a late fee, but they add all of the late fees. When people can't pay their debts and they owe more and more, all of that's considered in addition to GDP. When housing becomes more expensive and prices American labor out of the market, that's called increase in GDP. This is not how a country that wants to develop is going to create its national income accounts. So there's a long discussion in China about just, to answer your question, how do you create an account to distinguish between what's a necessary cost of production and what's an unnecessary production cost, and how do we avoid doing what the United States did? So that again, no rivalry. The United States is an object lesson for China in what to avoid, not only in deindustrializing the economy, but in creating a picture of the economy as if everybody earns everything and there's no exploitation. There's no unearned income. Nobody makes money in their sleep, and there's no 1%. Well, that's what's really at issue, and why the whole world is splitting apart is you and I discussing what we're writing.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. So to sum it all up, can we say that the Beijing strategy to save especially provincial areas from leasing their land, their infrastructure for 60 years or 75 years, as you just mentioned, can we say that their national, the fulcrum of their national strategy is what you define as the market rent tax? Is this the #1 mechanism that they are developing?
Ideally, they want to keep rents as low as possible because rents are a cost of living and a cost of doing business. They don't have banks that are lending to inflate the real estate market. However, in almost every Western country, the value of stocks and the value of stocks and bonds and the value of real estate is just about exactly the same for the US, Germany, England. But for China, the value of real estate is way, way larger than the value of stocks. And the reason is not because the Chinese central bank and the Bank of China lend for real estate. It's because they lend to intermediaries, and the intermediaries have financed a lot of housing purchases in China. And this is really the problem. If they levy a land tax, then you're going to make a lot of these financial intermediaries go bust. that's what I'm advocating. I don't think that's a bad thing. These financial intermediaries shouldn't exist. And this same issue came up in 2009 in the United States. You had the leading American bank being the most crooked, internally false bank in the country, Citibank, making junk mortgages, and it was broke. Its entire net worth was wiped out as a result of its fraudulent junk mortgages. Well, Sheila Bair, the head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, wanted to close it down and take it over. And essentially that would have made it into a public bank. And that would be a wonderful thing. She said, look, Citibank shouldn't be doing what it's doing. And she wrote all this up in the book, that her autobiography about it. And she was overruled by President Obama and Tim Geithner, saying, "But wait a minute, those are our campaign contributors. That's who we're loyal to, the campaign contributors, not our voters." And they didn't close Citibank down. And the result is that the whole Federal Reserve ended up creating trillions of about $7 trillion of quantitative easing to bail out the banks. The homeowners weren't bailed out. 10 million American families lost their homes as a result of junk mortgages in an excess of what the property was actually worth. All of this was left on the books, foreclosed, sold to private capital companies like Blackstone. And the result is that homeownership in America declined from 68% of the population down to about 61%. Well, right where the Obama administration left off, you're about to have the Biden administration began in January with an estimated 5 million Americans losing their homes. They're going to be evicted because they've been unemployed during the pandemic. They have not been, they've been working in restaurants or gyms or other industries that have been shut down because of the pandemic. They're going to be evicted, and many homeowners, low-income homeowners, have been unable to pay the mortgages. There's going to be a wave of foreclosures there. The question is, who's going to bear the cost? Should it be 15 million American families lose their homes just so the banks won't lose the money? Or should you let the banks that have met all of the growth since 2008 has been by the 1% or by the 5% of the population? 95% of American GDP of the population has seen its wealth go down. All the wealth has been accumulating for the 5% in statistics. Now, the question is, should this 5% that's got all the wealth lose, or should the 95% lose? The Biden administration says the 95% should lose, basically, and you're going to see a wave of foreclosures. The question is, in China, should these intermediate banks that are near banks, they're not really banks, they're sort of like payday loan lenders, should they come in and bear the loss, or should Chinese localities and the people bear the loss? Somebody has to lose when you're collecting the land's rent that was paid to the creditors, and either the creditors have to lose or the tax collector loses. And that's the conflict that exists in every society of the world today. And in the West, the idea is the tax collector should lose, and whatever the tax collector relinquishes should be free for the banks to collect. In China, obviously, they don't want that to happen, and they don't want to see a financial class developing along US lines.
Mm-hmm. Michael, there's a quick question in all this, which is the official position by Beijing in terms of helping the localities. Their official position is that there won't be any bailouts of local debt. How do they plan to do that?
That's what they're discussing. How are you not going to do it? they think they've sort of let localities go their own way. And they think, well, you know, which ones are going to succeed and which ones aren't. They didn't want to have a one-size-fits-all central planning. They wanted to have flexibility. Well, now they have flexibility. And when you have many different, let 100 flowers bloom, not all the flowers are going to bloom at the same rate. And the question is, if they don't bail out the cities, how are the cities going to operate? Certainly, China has never let markets steer the economy. The economy, the government steers the markets. That's what socialism is, as opposed to finance capitalism. So the question is, you can let you can let localities go broke, and yet you're not going to destroy any of the physical assets of the localities. All of this is going to be in place. The question is, how are you going to arrange the flow of income to all of these roads and buildings and land that's in place? How do you create a system? And essentially they're saying, well, if we're industrial engineers, how do we just plan things, forget credit, forget the property claims, forget the rentier claims. How are we just going to design an economy that operates most efficiently? And that's what they're working at now to resolve this situation, because it's got fairly critical, especially in the countryside.
Especially in the countryside, exactly. Well, I think a very good metaphor in terms of comparing both systems is investment in infrastructure. Now, you travel to China a lot, so you've seen, you travel through a high-speed rail, you've seen those fantastic airports in Pudong or the new airport in Beijing, and then you take the Acela to go from Washington to New York City, which is something that I used to do years ago, and the comparison is striking, isn't it? Or if you go to France, for instance, when France started developing the TGV, in terms of a national infrastructure network, is one of the best networks on the planet. And the French started doing this 30 years ago, even more. Is there, it's not in terms of way out, but if we analyze the minutiae, it's obvious that following the American financialization system, we could never have something remotely similar happening in the United States in terms of building infrastructure, right? So do you see any realistic bypass mechanism in terms of improving American infrastructure, especially in the big cities?
No, and there are two reasons for that. Number one, let's take a look at the long-term railroads. The railroads go through the center of town, or even in the countryside. All along the railroads brought business, and all the businesses have been located as close to the railroad tracks as you can. Factories with sidings off the railroad, hotels, and especially right through the middle of town where you have the railway gates going up and down. In order to make a high-speed rail, as in China, you need a dedicated roadway without trucks and cars. Imagine a car going through a railway gate at 350 miles an hour. So when I would go from Beijing to Tianjin, here's the high-speed rail. There's one highway on one side, one highway on the other side. There'll be underpasses, but it goes straight. Now, how can you suppose you would have a straight Acela line from Washington up to Boston? How all along the line, there's all this real estate right along the line have been built up. There's no way you can get a dedicated roadway without having to tear down all of this real estate that's on either side, and the cost would be of making the current owners whole is prohibitive. And anywhere you would go that's not in the central of the city, you would also have to have the problem of there's already private property there, and that's There's no legal constitutional way for such a physical investment to be made. China was able to make this investment because it was still largely rural. It wasn't as built up along the railways. It didn't have any particular area that was built up right where the railroad already was. So certainly any high-speed rail could not go where the current railways would be, and they'd have to go on somebody's land. And there's also, what do you do, like if you want to get to New York and Long Island from, we're an island here, off from New Jersey. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when I went into Wall Street, the cost of transporting a good from California to Newark, New Jersey was as large as from Newark right across the Hudson River to New York, because of not only because of the mafia in control of the local labor unions, but because of the tunnels. Right now, the tunnels from New Jersey to New York are broke. Are leaking, they're broke. The subways in New York City, where I am, continually break down because there was a hurricane a few years ago, and the switches were made in the 1940s. The switches are 80 years old. They had water damage, and the trains have to go at a crawl. But the city and state, because it has not collected real estate tax and other taxes, and because ridership fell on the subways to about 20%, the city's broke. They're talking about 70% of city services being cut back. They're talking about cutting back the subways to 40% capacity, meaning everybody will have to get in, and when there's still a virus and not many people are wearing masks, and there's no means of enforcing masks here. So there's no way that you can rebuild the infrastructure, because for one thing, the banking system here has subsidized for 100 years junk economics, saying you have to balance a budget. If the government creates credit, it's inflationary. As if when banks create credit, it's not inflationary. Well, the monetary effect is the same no matter who creates the money. And so Biden has already said that President Trump ran a big deficit. We're going to run a budget a budget balance, and he was advocating that all along. We're going, essentially Biden saying, we have to increase unemployment by 20%, lower wages by 20%, and shrink the economy by about 10% in order for the banks not to have money. And we're going to privatize, but we're going to privatize by selling the hospitals, the schools, the parks, the transportation to Wall Street finance capital groups. And so you can imagine what's going to happen if the Wall Street groups buy the infrastructure. They'll do what happened to Chicago when it sold its parking meters. They'll say, okay, instead of 25 cents an hour, let's charge you $3 an hour. Instead of $2 for the subway, let's make $8 for the subway. You're going to price American economy even further out of the business, because they say that public investment is socialism. Well, it's not socialism. It's industrial capitalism. It's basic industrialization. It's basic economics. And yet the idea of how an economy works is so twisted academically that it's the antithesis of what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Marx all talked about. For them, a free market economy was an economy free of rentiers, free of rent. It didn't have any rent seeking. Now, for the Americans, a free market economy is free for the rentiers, free for the landlords, free for the banks to make a killing. And that is basically the class war is back in business with a vengeance. Over here, and that blocks, that is preventing any kind of infrastructure recovery. I don't see how it can possibly take place.
Well, what you just described is a process of turning the United States into a giant Brazil, in fact. This is what the Brazilian finance ministry, Paulo Guedes, a Pinochetista, as you know, Michael, is doing with the Brazilian economy for the past 2 years. Privatizing everything and selling everything to big Brazilian interests, and with lots of Wall Street interests involved as well.
That's right. And
so this is a recipe that goes all across the global South as well, and it's fully copied all across the global South with no way out. No?
Yes, this is promoted by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And when I was brought down to Brazil to meet with the Council of Economic Advisors under Lula, they said, well, the whole problem is that Lula's been obliged to let the banks do the planning. So basically, free markets and libertarianism is a doctrine of central planning, but it's central planning by the banks. America is a much more centrally planned economy than China. China is letting 100 flowers bloom. America's concentrated the planning and the resource allocation in Wall Street. And that's a central planning that is much more corrosive than any government planning could be. Now, the irony is that China is sending its students to America to study economics. And most of the Chinese I talk to say, well, we went to America to take economics courses because that gives us a prestige here in China. And so I'm working now with Chinese groups trying to develop a reality economics to be taught in China is different from the American economics.
Exactly, because what they study at Beijing University, Renmin or Tsinghua is not exactly what they would study in the big American universities, right? Probably what they study in the US is not to do in China, when they come back to China, what they won't be doing in China.
Yes, it's an object lesson for what to avoid.
It's an object lesson.
Yes.
Michael, in terms of, I'd like to go back to what the BRICS had been discussing since the 2000s when Lula was still as president of Brazil, and many of his ideas deeply impressed, especially Hu Jintao at the time, which is bypassing the US dollar. At the moment, obviously, we're still at what? The US dollar is what, 87% of international transactions still. So we are very far away from it. But if you have a truly sovereign economy, which is the case of China, which we can say is the case of Russia to a certain extent, and obviously in a completely different framework, Iran is a completely sovereign, independent economy from the West. The only way to try to develop different mechanisms to not to fall into the rentier mind space would be to bypass the US dollar.
Yes, for many reasons. For one thing, the United States can simply print the dollars and lend to other countries and then say, now you have to pay us interest. Well, they don't, Russia doesn't need American dollars. It can print its own rubles to provide, do its labor. There's no need for a foreign currency at all for domestic spending. The only reason you would have to borrow a foreign currency is to balance your exchange rate or to finance a trade deficit. But China doesn't have a trade deficit. And in fact, if China were to accept more dollars, if Americans would love to buy into the Chinese market and make a profit there, but that would push up China's exchange rate, and that would make it more difficult for it to make its exports because the exchange rate would come up, not because it's exporting more, but because it's letting American dollars come in and push it up. Well, fortunately, President Trump, it's as if he works for the Chinese National Committee. He said, look, we don't want to really hurt China by pushing up its currency. We want to keep it competitive. So I'm going to prevent American companies from lending money to China. I'm going to isolate it. And so he's helping them protect protect their economy. And in Russia, he said, look, Russia really needs to feed itself. There's a real danger that when the Democrats come in, there are a lot of anti-Russians in the Biden administration. They may go to war. They may do to Russia what they tried to do to China in the 50s, stop exporting food and grain when only Canada was able to break the embargo. So we're going to impose sanctions on Russia. So Russia what has happened? Russia very quickly became the largest grain exporter in the world. Instead of importing cheese from the Baltics, it created its own cheese industry.
They make their own cheese. Yeah.
So Trump said, look, I know that Russians followed the American idea of not have protective tariffs. They need protective tariffs. They're not doing it. We're going to help them out by just not importing to them. And so he's really helping them and China he's speeding the parting guest.
Yeah. Michael, what do you think BlackRock wants from the Chinese? You know that they are making a few inroads at the highest levels, of course. I'm sure you're aware of that. And also JP Morgan, Citibank, etc. What do they really want?
They'd like to be able to create dollars to begin to buy, make loans to real estate and to companies, let the companies grow, and let the real estate market grow, and make capital gains. The economy, the way people get wealthy today isn't by making an income. It's by making a capital gain. Total returns are current income plus the capital gains, and the capital gains each year, the land value gains alone are larger than the whole GDP growth from year to year. So that's where the money is, that's where the wealth is. So they're after speculative capital gains. They would like to push money into the Chinese stock market and real estate market, see the prices go out, and then inflate the prices by buying in, and then sell out at a high price, pull the money out, get a capital gain, and let the economy crash. I mean, that's the business plan.
Exactly. But this would, Beijing would never allow that.
Well, here's the problem right now. They know that Biden is pushing militarily aggressive people in its cabinet. China there's one kind of overhead that China is really trying to avoid, and that's the military overhead. Because if you spend money on military, you can't spend it on the real economy. They're very worried about the military, and they say, how do we deter the Biden administration from actually trying to do a military adventure in the China Sea or elsewhere? They said, well, fortunately, America's multi-layered. They don't think of America as a group. They realize there's a layer, and they say, who's going to represent our interests? Well, Blackstone and Wall Street are going to represent their interests. And I think one of the Chinese officials last week gave a big speech on this very thing, saying, look, our best hope in stopping America's military adventurism as China is to have Wall Street acting as our support, because after all, Wall Street is the main campaign contributor, and the president works for the campaign contributors. The politicians work for the campaign contributors. They're in it for the money. So fortunately, we have Wall Street on our side. We've got control of the political system, and they're not going to go to war. So that helps explain why a month ago they let wholly owned U.S. banks and banking firms and investment bankers in. On the one hand, they don't like the idea of somebody outside the government creating credit for completely different, for reasons that the economy doesn't need. If the economy needed it, the Bank of China would, and
the Bank of China, exactly.
They have no need for foreign currency to come in to make loans in domestic currency to China. The only reason that they could do it is, number one, it helps meet the World Trade Organization principles, and number two, it helps for the time being, especially during this formative few months of the Biden administration, helps Wall Street saying, we can make a fortune in China, go easy on them, don't it? And essentially counter the military hawks in Washington. That's my view.
So, so do you foresee a scenario when, for instance, BlackRock start wreaking havoc in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, for instance?
It would love to do that. It would love to put things up and down. The money's made by companies like with the zigzags. So of course it wants to do predatory zigzags. The question is whether China will impose a transaction tax to stop this, all sorts of financial taxes to stop it. That's what's under discussion now. They know exactly what BlackRock wants to do because they have some very savvy billionaire Chinese advisors who are quite telling. I could tell you stories, but I better not.
I know. Okay, if it's not okay, tell us part of the story then.
The American banks have been cultivating leading Chinese people by providing them enough money to make money here that they think that, okay, they will now try to make money in the same way in China and we can join in. It's a conflict of systems, again, a conflict between the finance capital system and industrial socialism. That and you know, in Washington, you don't get any of this discussion in the U.S. press, which is why I read what you write. Because in the U.S. press, there's the neocons talk about this sort of fake. They have a fake idea of Greek history and a fake Thucydides, and this idea of the Thucydides problem of a country jealous of another country's development. There's no jealousy between America and China. They're saying they're different. They're their own way. We want to destroy them. And if you look at the analogies that the Americans draw, and this is how the Pentagon thinks, with the war between Athens and Sparta. It's hard to tell which is which. Here you have Athens, a democracy, backing other democracies and having the military support of the democracies. And the military, these democracies all had to pay Athens protection money for the military support, and that it was the money that Athens got for its ostensibly to support its navy and protection that built up all of the Athenian public buildings and everything else. So you had a democracy exploiting its allies to enrich itself for military. Then you had Sparta, which was funding all of the oligarchies, and it was helping the oligarchies overthrow democracies. Well, that was America too. So America is both sides of the Thucydides war. It's the democracy exploiting the fellow democracies, and it's the supporter of oligarchies in Brazil, Latin America, Africa, and everyone else. So you could say the Thucydides problem is between two aspects of America. It has nothing to do with China at all. Except for the fact that the whole war was a war between economic systems, and that's what they're acting as if somehow, if only China did not export to us, we could be reindustrialized and somehow export to Europe and the third world. And as you and I have described, it's over. We painted ourselves into such a debt corner that without writing down the debts, we're in the same position that the Eurozone is in. There's so much money that goes to the creditors, to the top 1% or 5%, that there's no money for capital investment, there's no money for growth. And really since 1980, as you know, wages in America have been stable. All the growth has been in property owners and creditors and the fire sector. The rest of the economy is in stagnation. And now with the coronavirus has simply acted as a catalyst to make it very clear that, okay, it's time to move away from a homeowner economy to a rentier economy, a rent economy. Time for Blackstone to be the landlord. America wants to recreate the British landlord class, and essentially what we're seeing now is like the Norman invasion of England, taking over the land and the infrastructure. That's what Blackstone would love to do in China.
Wow, I'm afraid they may have a lot of leeway by some members of the Beijing leadership now, because as you know very well, it's not a consensus in the Politburo. No?
That's why we're talking about volume 2 and 3 of Capital, not just
Volume 2 and 3 in Capital, exactly. But in terms, you were talking about that. Coming back to that, in fact, I just checked this morning. Apparently, global debt, as it stands, it's $277 trillion. Global debt, which is something like 365% of global GDP. What does that mean in practice, Michael?
Well, fortunately, there was this is discussed in the 19th century, and there was a word for that: fictitious capital.
Fictitious capital.
Capital is a debt that can't be paid, but you keep it on the books anyway. And every country has this. You could say the question now, the Financial Times just had an article a few days ago on is China's claim on third world countries on the Belt and Road Initiative fictitious capital, because how can it collect? Well, China's already thought of that. It doesn't want money, it wants the raw materials. It wants to be paid in real, but much of the debt that can't be paid can only be paid either by foreclosing on the debtors or by writing down the debts. And obviously, a debt that can't be paid won't be paid. And so you had not only Marx using the word fictitious capital, at the other end of the spectrum, you had Henry George talking about fictive capital. In other words, these are property claims that have there's no real capital behind them. There's no capital that makes profit. It's just a property claim for payment, a rentier claim for payment. So the question is, can you make money somehow without having any production at all? Without having wages, without having profits, without having capital? Can you just have asset grabbing and buying and selling assets? And as long as you have the Federal Reserve in America come in, Trump just gave Trump's $10 trillion COVID program, gave $2 trillion to the population at large with these $1,200 checks that my wife and I got, and $8 trillion all just to buy stocks and bonds. None of this $8 trillion was to build infrastructure. None of this $8 trillion was to build a single factory. None of this $8 trillion was to employ a single worker. It was all just to support the prices of stocks and bonds and to keep the illusion that the economy had not stopped growing. Well, it's growing for the 5%. So it's all become fictitious. The fictitious. Yeah. And if you look at the GDP, as I said, it's fictitious.
And the most extraordinary thing is none of that is discussed in American media. Absolutely, there's not a single word about what you have been describing.
And it's not even discussed in academia. Our graduates at the University of Missouri at Kansas City were all trained in modern monetary theory. And in order to get hired as professors, they had to be able to publish in the refereed journals. And the refereed journals are all controlled by the essentially Chicago school censors. So you have a censorship of the kind of ideas that we're talking about. You can't get it into the economic journals, so you can't get it into the economics curriculum. So where on earth are you going to get it? If you didn't have the internet, you wouldn't be discussing it all. My books sell mainly in China, more than in any other, all the other countries put together. So I can discuss these there, and there's just, I stopped publishing in Orthodox journals many years ago because it's talking to the deaf.
Absolutely, yeah. Can I ask you a question about Russia, Michael? There is a raging debate in Russia for many years now between the, let's say, the Eurasianists and the Atlanticists. It involves, of course, economic policy under Putin, industrial capitalism, Russian style. And the Eurasianists basically say that the central problem with Russia is how the Russian central bank is basically affiliated with all the mechanisms that you know so well. That is an Atlanticist Trojan horse inside the Russian economy. How do you see it?
Russia was brainwashed by the West when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. They were convinced not that somehow you had, first of all, the IMF announced in advance. There was a big meeting in Houston with the IMF and the World Bank, and the IMF published all of its reports saying, first you need to wipe out all, you don't want inflation in Russia, so let's wipe out all of the Russian savings with hyperinflation, which they did. They then said, well, now to cure the hyperinflation, the Russian central bank needs a stable currency, and you need to back it with a currency. You need to back it with US dollars. So from the early 1990s, as you know, labor was going unpaid. Russia central bank could have created the rubles to pay the domestic labor and to keep the factories in place. But the IMF advisors from Harvard said, no, you have to borrow US dollars. I met with people, the Hermitage Fund and Renaissance Fund and others who had meetings, and I met with the investors, and Russia was paying 100% interest per year to leading American financial institutions for dollars that it didn't need. It could have created itself. Russia was so dispirited with Stalinism, essentially, that it thought, what's the opposite of Stalinism? It must be what they have in America. And they thought that America was going to tell it how America got rich. But America didn't want to tell Russia how it got rich. It wanted to make money off Russia. They didn't get it. They trusted the Americans. They thought they didn't understand. They really didn't understand that industrial capitalism that Marx described had metamorphosized into finance capitalism and was completely different. And that's because Russia didn't charge rent. It didn't charge interest. I gave I gave 3 speeches before the Duma, urging it to impose a land tax. Some of the people, I noticed Ed Dodson was on here, he was there with us, and we were all trying to convince Russia, don't let this be privatized. If you let it be privatized, then you're going to have such high rents and housing costs in Russia that you're not going to be able to essentially compete with foreign industrial growth. Well, the politician who brought us there, Vyacheslav Zelensky, was sort of maneuvered out of election by the American advisors. The Americans put billions of dollars in to essentially finance American propagandists to destroy Russia, mainly from the Harvard Institute of International Development. And essentially they were a bunch of gangsters. And the Federal Reserve of the prosecutors in New York were about to prosecute them. Not in New York, in Boston. New York was dominated by Wall Street. So the Attorney General of Boston was going to bring a big case for Harvard against the looting of Russia and the corruption of Russia. And I was asked to organize, to bring a number of Russian politicians and industrialists over to say how this had destroyed everything. Well, Harvard settled out of court, pleading no, and essentially made the perpetrators the leading university people up there. I'm associated with Harvard's anthropology department, not the economics.
Yeah. Not economics. Yeah, right.
So the case never, we never had a chance to bring my witnesses and have our report on what happened. But I published I published for the Russian Academy of Sciences a long study of how all of this destruction of Russia was laid out in advance at the Houston meetings by the IMF, and the Russians somehow thought, when I say the Russians, America went to the leading bureaucrats who headed government. He said, look, we can make you rich. Why don't you register the factories in your own name? And if you're registered in your own name, then you'll own it, and then you can cash out. You can essentially sell, but obviously you can't sell to the Russians because the IMF have just wiped out all of their savings. You can only cash out by selling to the West. And so the Russian stock market became the leading stock market in the world from 1994 with the Norilsk Nickel and the 7 bankers and the bank loans for shares deal through 1997. And I'd worked for a firm, Scudder Stevens, and the head advisor, a former student of mine, didn't want to invest in Russia because she said, this is just a ripoff, it's going to crash. She was fired for not, they said, look, we know it's going to crash. That's the whole idea, it's going to crash. We can make a mint off it before the crash. And then we can make, when it crashes, we can make another mint by selling short and then
By
buy
selling short, yeah.
and do it all over again. Well, the problem is that the system that was put in with the privatization that's occurred, how do you have Russia's wealth used to develop its own industry and its own economy like China was doing? Well, China has rules for all of this, but Russia doesn't have a rule. It's really all centralized. It's President Putin that keeps it this way. Well, this is the great fear of the West. When you had Yevgeny Gorbachev begin to plan to do pretty much what is done today to restrain private capital, the IMF pulled off, it said, we're not going to make any loans to stabilize the Russian currency until you remove Mr. Gorbachev. The US said, we won't deal with you until you remove him. So he was pushed out, and he was probably the smartest guy at the time there. So they thought that Putin was going to be sort of a patsy, and he's sort of almost single-handedly holding the oligarchs in and saying, look, you can keep your money as long as you do exactly what the government would do. You can keep the gains as long as you're serving the public interest. But none of this is created into a legal system, a tax system, and a system where the government actually does get most of the benefit. Russia could have emerged in 1991 as the most competitive economy in Eurasia by giving all of the houses to its people. Instead of giving Norilsk Nickel and the oil companies to Yukos and to Khodorkovsky, it could have given everybody their own house and their own apartment. The same thing in the Baltics. And instead, it didn't give the land to the people. And Russians were paying 15% of their income for housing in 1990. And that was low, whereas, I'm sorry, it was 3%. 3% of their income.
3%.
3%. And in the West, it was 30% to 40%. Russia could have had, and that rent is the largest element in every homeowner's budget. So Russia could have had low-priced labor. It could have financed all of its capital investment for the government by taxing, collecting the rising rental value. And instead, Russian real estate was privatized on credit. And it was even worse in the Baltics. In Latvia, where I was research director for the Riga Graduate School of Law, Latvia borrowed primarily from Swedish banks. And so you had, in order to buy a house, you had to borrow from the Swedish banks. And they said, well, we're not going to lend in Latvian currency because it can go down. You'll borrow, and you have a choice: Swiss francs or German marks or US dollars. And so all of this rent was paid in foreign currency, became an outflow that essentially drained all the Baltic economies. Latvia's lost 20% of its population. Estonia and Lithuania followed suit. And of course, the worst hit was Russia by neoliberalisms. And as you know, President Putin said that neoliberalism cost Russia more of its population loss than World War II did. And that the way to destroy a country, you don't need an army to destroy a country anymore. All you have to do is teach it American economics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Then
I remember well, I arrived in Russia in 91, in the winter of 91, coming from China. So this was, I transited from the Chinese miracle. In fact, a few days after Deng Xiaoping's famous Southern tour, when he went to Guangzhou and Shenzhen, and that was the kick for the 1990s boom, in fact, now a few years before the handover. And then I took the Trans-Siberian and I arrived in Moscow a few days after the end, in fact, a few weeks after the end of the Soviet Union. But I remember the Americans arrived almost at the exact minute, wasn't it, Michael? I think they already were there in in the spring of 1992, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, it was the Houston meeting in 1990.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But before that, already in 1988 and 1989, there was a huge outflow of embezzlement money via Latvia.
Latvia, right. Uh-huh.
The assistant dean of the university, and who ended up creating Nordex. Essentially, the money was all flowing out because Latvia was where Ventspils was, where Russian oil was exported, and it was all fake invoicing. So the Russian kleptocrats basically made their money off false export invoicing, ostensibly selling it for one price and having the rest paid abroad. And this was all organized through Latvia, and the man later moved to Israel and finally gave $1 billion back to Russia so that he wanted to live safely for the rest of his life in Israel.
Well, the crash of the ruble in 1998 was what, roughly 1 year after the crash of the baht and the whole Asian financial crisis. Nah? It was interlinked, of course, but let me see if I have a question for you. In fact, I'm just thinking out loud now. If the economies of Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, the case of South Korea, sorry, and Russia were more integrated at the time as they are trying to integrate now, do you think that the Asian financial crisis would have been preventable in 1997?
Well, look at what happened at Malaysia with Mohammed Mahathir.
Yes.
Malaysia avoided it, so of course it was preventable.
And they had capital controls.
Capital controls. That was what you did. All you would have needed was to do what Malaysia did. So but you needed an economic theory for that. And essentially, if the current mode of warfare is to conquer the brains of a country, to shape how people think and how they perceive the economy from working. And if you can twist their view into an unreality economics, where they think that you're there to help them, not to take money out of them, then you've got them hooked. And that was what happened in Asia. Asia thought it was getting rich off the dollar inflows, and then the IMF and the all the creditors pulled the plug, crashed the industry, and now that all of a sudden you had a crash, they bought up Korean industry and other South Asian industries. You know, it give away prices. That's what you do. You lend the money, you pull the plug, you let them go under, and you pick up the pieces. That's what Blackstone did after the Obama depression began, when Obama saved the banks, not his constituency, the mortgage owers. Essentially, that's Blackstone's modus operandi. Pick up distressed prices at a bankruptcy sale. But you need to lend money and then crash it in order to make that work.
Michael, I think we have only 5 minutes left. So this is I would expect you to go on a relatively long answer, and I'm really dying for it. It's about debt, it's about debt trap, and it's about the New Silk Roads, the Belt and Road Initiative. Because I think, rounding up our discussion and coming back to the theme of debt and global debt, the number one criticism, okay, apart from demonization of China, that you hear from American media and a few American academics as well against Belt and Road, is that it's creating a debt trap for Southeast Asian nations, Central Asia, nations in Africa, etc. Obviously, I expect you to debunk that, but the framework is there is no other global development project as extensive and as complex as Belt and Road, which, as you know very well, was initially dreamed up by the Ministry of Commerce. Then they sold it more or less to Xi Jinping, who got the geopolitical stamp on it, announcing it simultaneously, which was a stroke of genius, in Central Asia, in Astana, and then in Southeast Asia, in Jakarta. So he was announcing the overland corridors through the heartland and the Maritime Silk Road at the same time. At the time, people didn't see the reach and the depths, all that. And now, of course, during the Trump administration, finally the Trump administration woke up and saw what was in play, not only across Eurasia, but reaching Africa and even selected parts of Latin America as well. And obviously, the only sort of it's not even fact-based criticism that I've seen about Belt and Road is it's creating a death trap because Laos is indebted, Sri Lanka is indebted, Kyrgyzstan is indebted, etc. So how do you view Belt and Road within the large framework of the West and China, East Asia, Eurasia relations? And how would you debunk this myth created, especially in the US, that this is a death trap?
There are 2 points to answer that. The first is how the Belt and Road began. And as you pointed out, the Belt and Road began when China said, what is it that we need to grow, and how do we grow within our neighboring countries so we don't have to depend upon the West, and we don't have to depend on sea trade that can be shot down? How do we get roads instead of seas in a way that we can integrate our economy with the neighboring economies so that it can be a mutual growth? So this was done pretty much on industrial engineering. Here's where you need the roads and the railroads. And then how do we finance it? Well, the Financial Times article last week said, didn't the Chinese know that railroad development, they've all gone broke. The Panama Canal went broke, the first few times. All the European railway investment in Latin America in the 19th century, that all went broke. Well, what they don't get is China's aim was not to make a profit off the railroads. The railroads were built to be part of the economy.
Part of the economy.
Overall, the aim wasn't to make profit. It was to help the real economy grow, not to make profits for the owners of the railroad stocks. But the Western press can't imagine that you'd build a railroad without trying to make money off the railroad.
Without trying to make money out of it.
Well, then you get to the debt issue, and the debt. Countries only have a debt crisis if the debt is in a foreign currency. And the United States, ever since 1945, the first way that the United States gained power was to fight against its allies. The great enemy of America was England, and it made the British loan that prevented England from blocking its currency with a block currency in the 1940s. And so India and other countries that had all these currency holdings that in sterling were able to convert it all into dollars. The whole move of the US was to denominate world debt in dollars so that number one, the banks would end up with the interest in financing the debt. And number two, the United States could control, by using the debt leverage, control domestic politics. Well, as you're seeing right now in Argentina, for instance, Argentina is broke because it owes foreign dollar debt. When I started the first Third World Bond Fund in 1990 at Scudder Stevens, and Brazil and China and Argentina were paying 45% interest per year on 45%. 45% per year in dollar debt. We tried to sell them in America. No American would buy the fund that we had. We went to Europe. No European would buy this debt. And so we worked with Merrill Lynch, and Merrill Lynch was able to sell, to say, well, you make an offshore fund in the Dutch West Indies, and all of the debt was sold to the Brazilian ruling class in the central bank, and the Argentina bankers and the ruling class. And we thought, oh, that's wonderful. We know that they're going to pay the foreign debt, Yankee dollar debt, because the Yankee dollar debt is owed to themselves. They're the Yankees. They're what you call a client oligarchy. And as you know from Brazil, client oligarchy is, they're cosmopolitan, is the word.
Exactly.
Friedrich List used. So the problem is that on the Belt and Road, how do these other countries pay the debt to China? Well, the key there again is de-dollarization. And one way to solve it is, since we're trying to get finance out of the picture, we're doing something very much like Japan did with Canada in the 1960s. It made loans to develop a Canadian copper mine, taking its payment not in Canadian dollars, that would have pushed up the yen exchange rate, but in copper. China says, you don't have to pay currency for this debt. We can, we didn't build a railroad to get to make a profit in yen. We can print all the currency we want. We don't need to make a profit in yen. We made the Belt and Road because it's part of our geopolitical attempt to create a what we need to make to be prosperous and have a prosperous region, so they're self-reinforcing mutual gain. Well, that's what the West doesn't get. Mutual gain, are we talking anthropology?
Yeah, they don't understand the notion of mutual gain.
Primitive tribes? What do you mean mutual? This is capitalism. So there's the West doesn't understand what the original aim of the Belt and Road was, and it wasn't to make a profitable railroad to enable people to buy and sell railroad stocks, and it wasn't to make toll roads, to sell off to Goldman Sachs, to charge tolls. It was a different. We're dealing with two different economic systems, and it's very hard for one system to understand the other system because of the tunnel vision that you get when you get a degree in economics.
And the Belt and Road loans, they are a long-term and very low interest, and they are renegotiable. They are renegotiating with the Pakistanis all the time, for instance.
Yeah, China's intention is not to repeat an Asia crisis of 1997. It doesn't gain anything by forcing a crisis because it's not trying to come in and buy property at a discount. At a distress sale. It has no desire to create a distress sale. So obviously, the idea is the capacity to pay. Now, this whole argument occurred in the 1920s between Keynes and his opponents who wanted to collect German reparations. And Keynes made it very clear, what's the capacity to pay? It's the ability to export and the ability to obtain foreign currency. Well, China's not looking for foreign currency. It is looking for economic return, but the return is to the whole society. The return isn't from a railroad. The return is for the economy because it's looking at the economy as a system. And the way that neoliberalism worked, it divides the economy into parts and it makes every part trying to make a gain. And if you do that, then you don't have any infrastructure that's lowering the cost for the other parts. You have every part fighting itself. You don't look in terms of a system. And China's looking at it. That's the great advantage of Marxism. You look at the system, not at just the parts.
Exactly. And this is at the heart of the Chinese concept of a community with a shared future for mankind, which is the approximate translation from Mandarin, of course. So we compare community with a shared future for mankind, which is, let's say, the driving force between the idea of Belt and Road, expanded across Eurasia, Africa, and Latin America as well, with our good old friend, greed is good, from the 80s, which is still ruling America, apparently.
And the corollary is that non-greed is bad.
Exactly, and non-greed is evil. Michael, I think we ran out of time. I don't know if Alana wants to step in to wrap it up.
There may be somebody who has a question.
Or somebody has a question. That'll be fantastic.
Okay, Alana here. There is
Hi.
Hi, this has been just great, guys. I mean, this is the only webinar I've been on where the attendance kept increasing over time instead of decreasing. So we had spam in the chat, but there is one question that was a good question from Ed Dodson. And he wanted to know why there are these ghost cities in China. I mean, who's financing all this real estate that's developed, but nobody's living there? We've all been hearing about that. So what is happening with that?
Okay.
Michael.
One of China had most of its population living in the countryside, and it's made many deals with Chinese landholders who have land rights. And they said, if you will give up your land right to the community, we will give you 3 apartments in the city, the apartments that you can rent out. So China has been building apartments in cities and trading these basically in exchange for to support what used to be called a rural exodus. China doesn't need as many farmers on the land as it now has. And the question is, how are you going to get them into cities? So China has begun building these cities in order to give many of these apartments are owned by people who got them in exchange for trading their land rights. So it's part of a deal that they've made as part of the rural reconstruction program.
Do you think it was a good deal? Vacant apartments everywhere? You don't know, but that's why they did it.
But you don't have ghost cities in Xinjiang, for instance. Xinjiang is underpopulated. It's mostly deserts, and it's extremely sensitive to relocate people to Xinjiang. So basically, they concentrated on expanding Urumqi. When you arrive in Urumqi, it's like almost like arriving in Guangzhou. It's enormous. It's a huge generic city in the middle of the desert. And it's also a high-tech Mecca, which is something that very few people in the West know. And is the direct link between the Eastern Seaboard via Belt and Road to Central Asia. Last year, I was on an amazing trip. I went to the 3 borders, the Tajik Xinjiang border, Kyrgyz Xinjiang border, and the Kazakh Xinjiang border, which is 3 borders in one. It's a fascinating area to explore, and especially to talk to the local populations, the Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs, and the Tajiks. How do they see Belt and Road directly affecting their lives from now on? So you don't see yet something spectacular. For instance, in the Xinjiang Kazakh border, there is one border for the trucks. Lots of like in Europe, crossing from all points Central Asia to China and bringing Chinese merchandise to Central Asia. There's the train border, which is very simple, 2 tracks, and a pedestrian border, which is very funny because you have people arriving in buses from all parts of Central Asia. They stop on the Kazakh border, they take a shuttle, they clear customs for 1 day. They go to a series of shopping malls on the Chinese side of the border. They buy like crazy. The shop tea will drop for, I don't know, 12 hours. And then they cross back the same day because the visa is for 1 day. They step on their buses and they go back. So for the moment, it's that's sort of a pedestrian form of Belt and Road. But in the future, we're going to have high-speed rail. We're going to have, well, the pipelines are already there, as Michael knows. But it's fascinating to see on the spot how, and you see the closer integration. You see, for instance, Uyghurs traveling back and forth. Uyghurs that have families in Kyrgyzstan, for instance. I met some Kyrgyz, some Uyghurs in Kyrgyzstan who do the back and forth all the time. And they said, no, it's no problem. They see us as businessmen. There's no interference. There are no concentration camps involved, So, but you have to go to these places to see how it works on the ground. And with COVID, that's the problem for us journalists who travel, because for 1 year we cannot go anywhere. And Xinjiang was on my travel list this year, Afghanistan as well, Mongolia. These are all parts of Belt and Road or future parts of Belt and Road, like in Afghanistan. Like the Chinese and the Russians as well, they want to bring Afghanistan in a peace process organized by Asians themselves without the United States within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because they want Afghanistan to be part of the intersection of Belt and Road and the Eurasian Economic Union. So, and this is something Michael knows very well. You don't see this kind of discussions in the American media, for instance. You know, integration of Eurasia on the ground, how it's actually happening. You know,
That's called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Dissonance.
To try to
Imagine that.
understand it gets you cognitive dissonance. So,
Oh yeah, of course, and obviously you are Chinese agents, Russian agents, etc. I hear that all the time. Well, in our jobs, we hear that all the time, especially from unfortunately our American friends.
okay, I know you have other things to do. This has been fabulous. I want to thank you so much, both of you. It was so easy to get attendance for this webinar. There were 20 people in 5 minutes enrolled, and in 2 days we were at capacity. So I know there are many more people who would love to hear you talk another time whenever you two are so willing. And I think you both got much out of your first conversation in person. Everybody listening, know that between these two wonderful gentlemen, they have written more than 10 books, and they have traveled all over the world. They are on the top of geopolitical and geonomic analysis, and they are caring, loving people. So you can see that these are the people we need to be listening to and understanding all around the world. So thank you so much. There's now going to be Ibrahima Drama at the Henry George School to say goodbye to you all and wrap this up. Thank you again.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Michael. It was a huge pleasure. Really, it was fantastic. Let's do this again.
That's really nice. I'm glad finally we're all on the same websites.
We're on this, exactly.
Great. So let's have a second version of this 2 months from now. Yes. Oh, and thank you very much for participating. And I really hope you like the event. And we also ask you to support us by making a tax-deductible donation to the Henry George School. I believe I shared the link on the chat. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Alana. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers.
Yes.